Hi, everybody. This is a rare pleasure. As most of you know, I've done many City Biz interviews, and today I'm really excited to be interviewing a dear friend and colleague, Mark Gerzon, who I've known for quite a few years. He's currently president and founder of Mediators Foundation, which we'll learn about a little bit later. But he goes way back in the field of trying to serve to bring our country together. He's written an incredible book on that subject, and I could go on and on. He's facilitated conflict resolution through the United States bipartisan congressional retreats many years ago, and Lord knows we need more of that today. So, Mark, thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to see you today.
It's
Thank you.
good to see you, David, and look forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you. Maybe a great way to start, which is in direct contrast to maybe what's happening in our country today. Your book, The Reunited States of America. It's certainly in these divided times more important than ever. What's your message in that book? What are your thoughts as to the relevancy today, why it's maybe more important today than ever?
Well, I wrote it, David, before Donald Trump became president in 2016. And I wrote it because I already knew we were headed in challenging directions. And so it's almost 8 years old now. And I think it is more timely than ever. I wrote it by really studying, not going to studying like a university professor, but studying like an anthropologist. What were Americans doing that was keeping our country united? And so it's a very positive book because I profiled 40 groups that are doing wonderful work, and many of them are still doing it now 8 years later. And the 40 that I profiled are actually kind of like I would say that they're a perfect portrait of the solution. We just need to take what those 40 groups are doing and take them to scale. And I'm glad to say more about who the 40 were and why they're my heroes.
Well, I'll probably give you the opportunity to do that, but this takes me back to, and I lose track of the years, 8 or 9 years ago. We might have been walking down the streets in Washington, D.C., and you were actually, I believe, the person who brought me to the concept of the Bridge Alliance, which I co founded and executive director of, which tried to create some ecosystem for this diverse community. And you presented that idea to me. Do you have a recollection of your thoughts
I,
back then?
yeah, it was at the same time as I was conceiving the book. And I thought to myself, okay, if there's 40 organizations, and of course I only wrote about 40, there's hundreds. I thought, why can't they be in some kind of an alliance together? And so, yeah, we talked about that because I felt like I wanted there to be a one-stop shop where people could say, gee, I want to do something to unite America. There's a lot of people working to tear apart America. What would I do if I wanted to unite America? And I thought instead of having to go to 400 different websites, what if they could go to one website and find out, oh, here's 400 organizations, however many. So now, 12 years later, thanks to you and your colleagues like Debbie Lynn Molyneux and others, there is the Bridge Alliance, and people can go there and find out about many organizations that are doing this work, a number of which I wrote about in the book and also are part of the film based on the book.
Well, tell us about the film a little, because and how would people? I think it's on YouTube. Tell us a little about that and how people might. It's more relevant than ever, as we said earlier. How people might view it and a little about it.
Well, it's a fun story. Someone was listening to the public radio in Dallas, Texas, and they heard me being interviewed about the book, and they called me, and we got to know each other. And it turned out he and his wife and kids were the star of the movie because they were a family that decided they wanted to sell their house, quit their jobs, get an RV, and travel around America. And their premise was the same as the book, and it was the heart of the movie, which is, how can you say you love America if you've never met America? And so they went to all 50 states for over a year and met America. And they are one of 5 major characters in the movie. And I love them all. Their name's the Levertons, and I love all the characters in the movie because, like I said, they're my heroes. Those 40 organizations are my heroes. The Bridge Alliance folks are my heroes because they are people who try to what I call hold the whole. And I believe, holding the whole is, some people call that patriotism. But I call it holding the whole because a lot of people who are patriots say, you know, I'm a patriot. I love the Americans who are just like me. Well, that's not what the flag's about. The flag isn't about I'll fall in love with the red star, red stripes or the white stripes. I love these stars, but not those stars. The flag is about the whole. So somebody who says I'm a patriot and I love the flag, and then they start tearing apart other Americans. Nah, that's not patriotism, and that's not the flag.
Well, I, like you, was very moved by David Leviton and his wife and their children and that trip he took across America. And he truly is a hero. And it's these type of stories. I mean, we can talk about facts and figures and data, but it's these stories, I think, that'll give Americans hope that we really can come together. And you brought back a memory to me of the movie itself. I could be wrong. I'll go out on a limb here. I think there was a story of a mother who suffered a great tragedy who's
Yeah.
in that movie. Yes, please
Yes.
tell
Yeah.
our audience about it.
Well, the filmmaker who approached me about making the movie had already interviewed the mother of Heather Heyer. And Heather Heyer was the white woman who was killed in Charlottesville by that driver who drove into the demonstrators who were protesting against the sort of neo-Nazi demonstration. And I was very moved by his video with her. And she's a beautiful woman and really loved her daughter. And yeah, he also tells the story of her and what she's done since her daughter's death. Because some people, after their daughter had been killed by someone who was, I guess, sympathetic with the racists and the neo-Nazis, she wasn't all about prosecuting the guy. She was about reaching out and helping people understand we're each other's neighbors and we don't need violence to resolve our problems. And she's been a real hero. She was one of the other characters, and the other characters were someone who ran as an independent for governor in Kansas, and a few other characters, all of whom are just Stephen Olakara, who ran the Millennial Action Project, which is state legislators under 40 who want to work together, and he's now running a project here at Mediators Foundation called Bridge Entertainment Labs, because I do believe just what you said, if David is true, that we need our facts straight, we need our figures and our charts, but we need to have a story that rings true and is true and moves people. And we're storytellers as people. That's what we did around fires for generations. We didn't look at charts and study Google around fires for the last generations. We told stories, and we need stories that bring us together, not stories that tear us apart.
Well, we certainly do. And you mentioned Mediators Foundation, so I might as well get into that now. I believe Mediators Foundation serves as a fiscal sponsor to offer a place for leaders to house to take their idea and to house it in an entity so it could grow and prosper. Do you want a couple? Do you have two or three Media Foundation organizations that immediately come to mind that you think our City Biz audience would be inspired by and love to hear about?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, in addition to being a fiscal sponsor that's basically creates a financial home, so they don't have to deal with the IRS themselves. We also we incubate the project and we help it grow from sort of idea into a real project. So we're we handle all the things that a startup needs to do, and we accelerate that startup. And we have a very small overhead, so we're not taking a lot of overhead from them. And one of the projects that I think your audience would probably relate to is we have a project that's about creating positive algorithms. Why don't we have algorithms that unite us rather than algorithms that divide us when we use the internet? So we have a positive algorithms project. I mentioned the Bridge Entertainment Labs. That's essentially the Hollywood office for the bridging movement. And it's basically saying to Hollywood, why don't we tell stories that are about connecting us rather than dividing us? And I love the Bridge Entertainment Labs. It's a great project. Living Room Conversations is with us, run by Joan Blades, which is a host for how people can, in their own living rooms and their own communities, have cross-partisan dialogues. And I'll mention also the Civic Health Project, which is a wonderful project based in Silicon Valley that's taken the lead in really trying to take the research that's in universities about how we connect with each other, take that research out of the university and translate it into action. So that's just a handful of projects, but we love our portfolio, and all someone has to do is go to mediatorsfoundation.org on the web, and they can find out about them in detail.
I suggest everybody do that. I'm not sure Mark remembers this, but the Bridge Alliance, when we first started, I don't know if it's 8 or 9 years ago, we were actually started in as a part of Mediators Foundation because it takes a while to become a 501c3. You're dealing with the government. It takes some resources and time and energy. And I don't think thanked you, but thank you so much for having the faith in us. And it gave us a year and a half head start before we could go out on our own. And
well, you are welcome. You're welcome. And the reason I didn't mention Bridge Alliance is that you're a former project of Mediators Foundation, but I'm glad you brought it up because our goal is not to keep a project for ourselves under our roof forever. Our goal is to incubate them and have them do just what Bridge Alliance did, which is become a successful organization that I think Bridge Alliance probably is larger now than Mediators Foundation. And so are many of the projects that we started. We're very proud of that because, after all, what is an incubator? An incubator is a place where you put a baby so the baby can come out of the incubator and become a thriving human being. And it's the same with media.
People haven't called me a baby in a long time, but I consider it an honor. And you always are searching for new ideas and new concepts. I might have the name wrong, and I think it's something you're researching now, but correct me if I'm wrong, if it's actually started yet. Something about city hubs, a way of a process, a business model, perhaps, maybe that's the wrong term, for citizens to become engaged. I mean, everybody talks about it, but how do you really get citizens involved and engaged?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, David, because the cutting edge of our work right now is a project called Better Together America. And it's based on the concept of Better Together Ohio, or Better Together, Frankfort, Kentucky, or Better Together Dallas. The idea is that the federal government is going to be dysfunctional and chaotic for a while. I don't know exactly when your listeners are going to hear our conversation, but regardless of whether it's in the second half of 2024 or early 2025, they're not going to see a functional government. They're going to see a government that's, as we all know, is quite divided and quite conflicted and quite dysfunctional. And that's regardless of the outcome in November. It's not going to be a highly functional, it's going to be a very partisan and divided government. And I think what we need to do as citizens of the 50 states is we need to make sure that our state has a robust democracy, or our city, or wherever we live. So the concept is just creating democracy hubs in different parts of the country and letting these democracy hubs be kind of, lighthouses of democracy, so that people in a city or a state can say, we're working together in the Arizona way, or the Michigan way, or the Colorado way, to make sure our state is a functioning democracy. And whatever happens in Washington, we'll deal with it. But meanwhile, our state's going to create a flourishing roadmap to a healthy democracy. And we're basically planning to help incubate those projects. And in some cases, many cases, they're already happening, but they don't know each other. If you're a Democrat, you know where to go. You go to the Democratic Convention. If you're a Republican, you go to the Republican Convention. But what if you're building bridges across? Where do you go? And so we're basically saying, why don't you go to your local democracy hub? That's the home for you.
Well, I've asked other people I've interviewed this question because a lot of them do have this optimism that's contagious. You're quite optimistic, yet I know you well enough to feel that you're a realist too. So right. What keeps you going? How do you remain optimistic? People say to me all the time, David, you've been doing this work for 8 years. It seems to be getting worse. Are you wasting your time? How would you answer that question? I know that's a tough one because I have trouble.
I do appreciate it because if people look at what I've written, most recently about the polycrisis, which is the word for the multiple crises that we're facing, I'm not at all naive about what's going on. The democracy is threatened, the environment's threatened, economic justice and equality is threatened, human rights are threatened, women's rights are threatened. There's a lot of problems that we're facing, But there's two ways of reacting, David, when things are hard and when you see a storm coming. If you see a storm coming, one way is to kind of go, oh, well, I better go hide. There's a storm coming. And the other way is to be proactive and realize, you need to prepare for that storm and you need to be ready for it. And so the democracy hubs, just to take as an example, I think we're in a world now where we're surrounded by not only the COVID virus, but many others. So I want a strong immune system. And all I see our work at Mediators is doing, David, and it's the Bridge Alliance too, is we're strengthening the immune system of American culture. We're strengthening the immune system so when toxins come in and these threats come in that are very serious, we have a strong immune system. And I had COVID a couple of months ago, and I'm pleased to say that after 5 or 6 days, I tested negative, and I was through. Why? Because I had an immune system. And I think our culture needs that. And I believe the immune system right now we need to invest in is on the state level, because the federal government is very, very hard right now to get to be creative and less partisan. But I think in states, I mean, you're sitting right now, I presume, in New Jersey. Am I right? Yeah. So
yes, sir.
A good case in point. If New Jersey could look out for New Jersey, it'd be a better place to live. But if New Jersey plays the Washington game of Democrats and Republicans arguing about everything and paralyzing everything, you're wasting the opportunity to be a laboratory for democracy. So whether it's in Michigan, I'm going to Ohio next week to speak to the Council of State Legislatures. Well, there'll be 11 state legislatures in Columbus, Ohio. And I'm going to say to all 11 states, the ones all the way from Wisconsin to Alabama, I'm going to say you're all laboratories for democracy. Why don't you show us how it's done and stop mimicking the dysfunction of Washington and having everything be right versus left? That's not the only way to play democratic baseball. We can play baseball a different way than they do in Washington.
Quite true. So I hope, especially young Americans, listen to that message, because they can. So democracy, I use this line a lot, is not a spectator sport, and they can make a difference if they're involved. And
can I say a quick
sure.
word about the role of business, because
yes, please.
we haven't yet talked about that, and I want to just stress to any of your listeners who see themselves as people who are part of the business world, that it's very easy to say, oh yeah, that's not what I do. I run my business. I'm in this industry or that industry. I'm not somebody who's a civic activist. And I totally respect that. And we don't all have to be civic activists, but the story I want to tell is I was working in Kenya for the UN, and the gentleman sitting next to me on the plane as I was going to another town to host a meeting, I said, what do you do? And he said, I'm CEO of a safari business. And I said, well, how's your business doing? And he said, not very well. He said, in fact, we're going bankrupt. I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Why'd that happen? He said, well, we had so much violence around the last election that tourists from around the world aren't coming to Kenya anymore to take safaris. And so suddenly I'm talking to a businessman who's realized that his business is going bankrupt because he didn't have the peaceful society around him he needed. And so I want to just say to any person who's listening from the business world, if you want your business to function and you want it to flourish, you need a flourishing society around you. You don't want to have one with violence and chaos where you're being careening back and forth between right and left regulations. You want a stable world in which your business can flourish. So in that sense, I think I happen to think that in the next 5 to 10 years, the real leaders in this civic action movement are going to be people from the business world because they know how to get things done.
Well, that's highly relevant for several reasons. One is this is city biz, and there will be a lot of business leaders who listen to this, and hopefully they hear your message. And it really resonates for me because I'm a businessman who never did anything in politics. Until about 12 years ago, I always thought it was highly dysfunctional and sort of just fell into it. So what you just said really resonates with me.
I just want to acknowledge you. I want to acknowledge you because you're an example of what I just talked about, that because of your business skills and your business background, you've made decisions about how to build the Bridge Alliance, how to build this podcast. You've made decisions that have really brought a lot to the field. And I think there are probably other business folks out there, particularly those in the second half of their lives where they've been successful, and they're saying, well, what next? And what I would say is, I'm not trying to talk about Donald Trump, but in The Art of the Deal, at one point in The Art of the Deal, he writes that he's done the biggest deals ever. And what he was talking about when he saw biggest deals ever, he was talking about buying and selling buildings in New York. Well, I have to say that from my point of view, the biggest deals ever are about making democracy work. That's the biggest deal ever. And so it's not about whether you bought or sold a building in New York. That's just a real estate transaction. The real deal for leaders like yourself and for myself, I think the real challenge is, can we create a society that works for everybody? And that's what I'd like to see more business people turning to in the second half of their lives.
Well, like so much in this interview, everything you say makes me think of a corollary thought. One of the programs I'm most involved with now is called the Engaged Athlete Fellowship. And we are doing something very similar. We profess something very similar to what you said. We want the college athletes to take their leadership skills that they learn on the field and use it to give back to society and be civically engaged. So that's a great analogy to what you just said about
Absolutely.
business leaders.
Yeah. I mean, the truth is, whether you're a citizen in education or in athletics or in business or in agriculture, I mean, there's almost no domain in which you, or the media, there's no domain in which you can't be a pro democracy activist. Because let's face it, there's not a single part of our society that we don't need to have a healthy society. That's why I use the word bridging a lot, because in fact, I'm going to say it in Columbus. I haven't been to Columbus, Ohio for a while, but I'm going next week, and I'm going to look around the city, and I guarantee you the city is only a city because it's got dozens of bridges. If it didn't have dozens of bridges, Columbus would not be a city. And I ask anybody who's listening, think about where you live, subtract the bridges from where you live, and you're thinking, oh boy, that would be a very fragmented community. Exactly. That's why I have a T-shirt that I was going to wear for this interview, but I decided to wear a nice shirt. But the T-shirt says "Build bridges, not walls."
There you go. Yes.
Yeah, because you need bridges to have a community.
Well, you've told a lot of great stories and provided a lot of great information today. And as we both said, it's the stories, I think, that ultimately will, of the common humanity, that'll bring us together. But I do have a question about your story, Mark. When you were growing up, were you naturally a facilitator? Were you naturally a person to bring people together? Or is it an art that you studied or came by? How did it happen?
Well, I don't know how far back you want to go, because
As a teenager,
all
what
right,
kind
you're a
of young man
teenager.
were you?
So I was a teenager. I think your listeners should know that I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, in one of the most conservative places in one of the most conservative times. Truly, a very conservative community in a very conservative time, the 1950s. By the late 1960s, I was at Harvard in one of the most liberal communities, in one of the most liberal places, at one of the most progressive, even radical times. So by the time I graduated from college, I'd had a deep immersion in conservatism and a deep immersion in liberalism. And I realized by the time I was 21, we're a country that's divided. And the story I can tell from those years is that I was compelled to deal with the Vietnam War, which was dividing the country, just like things are dividing the country today. And I had to decide, and in my 20s, I had to decide, okay, am I on the right or am I on the left? And I realized that once I picked the right or the left, I was part of the problem. That's how I felt. I thought, what am I going to solve if I'm on the right or the left? Do I just join this fight? And because I got to know people on the right and I got to know people on the left, and my experience with them was they were good people with real life experiences that they ended up with different political beliefs. But I wasn't going to turn any of them into my enemies, and I still feel that way. As long as they're not outright liars, right, and outright criminals, I can work with them. And I think that's not so much it's kind of a quick arc, but that shaped me in my 20s. And I'll tell you one other moment. The first job I ever had that was in politics, I'm very proud to say I was hired by 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans in the House of Representatives who were planning a bipartisan congressional retreat. And I was just excited because, we all have employers, at various times in our lives. And to have an employer that was 5 Ds and 5 Rs was perfect for me, because we had to design a retreat that would satisfy the Democrats and the Republicans. And I to this day feel very grateful that they hired me, because that confirmed for me that my idealism was practical, because they were tough people. They were members of the House of Representatives, and they wanted a tough, smart, credible person to design their retreat. And we managed to succeed. We had, over half the members of the House of Representatives went to the retreat, and it was very effective in the short term. And I say in the short term because, as everybody knows, it's not been effective in the long term. And that's the beginning of another interview.
Yeah. Well, perhaps 6 months we'll have another interview, because I do have so many more questions to ask you. But I can say this with certainty: you are not part of the problem. You've dedicated your life to being part of the solution. And actually, it just came to mind. I wrote a column in the Fulcrum yesterday. Might sound naive to certain people. It was entitled "After 50," or something like this. After 50 years, I'm still a believer. So after this interview, Mark, I'm still a believer. So thank you so much.
Oh, a pleasure, David. Thanks so much for having me.
My pleasure indeed. Thank you.